Bad Chad Customs built its reputation on wild car builds and even wilder personalities. Millions watched Chad Hiltz tear apart rusted metal and turn it into rolling art. But behind every frame, every weld, every finish machine, there was a woman most viewers barely noticed. Jolene McIntyre kept the shop alive in ways the cameras never fully captured. Who was really running things at Bad Chad Customs? The answer is more surprising than anyone expected. Keep watching. Kingsport, Nova Scotia, is not a place most people could find on a map. It is a small, quiet community on the shores of the Minas Basin. The kind of town where everyone knows their neighbor, where the winters are long and the summers are short, where people work hard and do not talk about it much. It was here, in this unassuming corner of Atlantic Canada, that one of Discovery Channel's most unexpected success stories was born. Bad Chad Customs did not start as a television show. It started as a dream and a garage. Chad Hiltz had been building custom cars for years before any camera crew arrived. His style was raw and unfiltered. He took vehicles that most people would have sent to a scrapyard and turned them into something extraordinary. Word spread. People took notice. And eventually, so did the producers at Discovery Channel. But long before the production trucks rolled into Kingsport, another person was already doing the unglamorous work of keeping that dream alive. Her name was Jolene McIntyre. Jolene grew up understanding what it meant to work. She was not someone who arrived at Bad Chad Customs looking for fame or television exposure. She arrived because she cared about the work, about the shop, and about the person building it. Her connection with Chad Hiltz went deeper than a professional arrangement. They were partners in life. And in the way that real partnerships work, that connection slowly extended into every corner of the business. In the early days of the shop, Jolene's role was informal. She helped where help was needed. She organized when organization was lacking. She tracked costs when the numbers started to blur. She answered calls that Chad was too busy to take. Nobody gave her a title. Nobody handed her a job description. She simply showed up every day and did what needed to be done. That quiet reliability would become the foundation of everything Bad Chad Customs would later achieve. People who watch the show closely, not just casually but closely, notice something that casual viewers often missed. In nearly every episode, somewhere in the background or briefly on screen, there was Jolene. Not performing, not seeking the camera, just working. That consistency was not accidental. The shop's day-to-day operations required more than mechanical skill. They required scheduling, budget management, client communication, parts sourcing, vendor relationships. These were not minor details. In a small custom shop operating on tight margins, these details were the difference between finishing a build and failing to deliver. Jolene handled them. She kept the financial side of the shop organized at a time when the creative side was constantly pulling in every direction. She tracked what money was coming in and what was going out. She made sure that the enthusiasm driving each project did not outpace the budget supporting it. For a shop like Bad Chad Customs, where ambition regularly exceeded resources, that kind of oversight was not a background function. It was a survival function. Beyond the numbers, Jolene also served as the shop's emotional anchor. Custom car builds are stressful. Deadlines slip. Parts do not arrive. Clients change their minds. Tempers run short. In those moments, the ability to stay calm and focused is as valuable as any mechanical skill. Jolene had that ability. She did not raise her voice when things went wrong. She assessed, adjusted, and moved forward. That steadiness kept the team functional during the moments when pressure threatened to break things apart. She also understood Chad in a way that few others did. She knew when to push, when to step back, and when to simply be present. That kind of knowledge, the kind built over years of real partnership, does not appear on any organizational chart, but it shapes the outcome of everything. By the time Discovery Channel came calling, Jolene McIntyre was not a newcomer to Bad Chad Customs. She was woven into it. Her fingerprints were on the finances, the scheduling, the client relationships, and the culture of the shop itself. The cameras would eventually show viewers a glimpse of her. But a glimpse was never the full picture. But as the cameras moved in and the show grew bigger, Jolene's role began to shift in ways nobody saw coming. Bad Chad Customs premiered on Discovery Channel and quickly found its audience. Viewers were drawn to Chad Hiltz's personality. Unpredictable, passionate, and deeply skilled. His builds were unlike anything else on television. He worked with unusual materials, chased wild concepts, and somehow made it all come together. The show had energy that felt real because in many ways it was. Fans tuned in from across North America and beyond. The comment sections filled up. The social media pages grew. A small shop in rural Nova Scotia had become, against all odds, a television phenomenon. But television brings its own kind of pressure. Production schedules are rigid. Episodes need content. Storylines need tension. Cameras need moments. And in the world of reality television, the moments that get chosen for broadcast are not always the most important ones. They're the most watchable ones. That distinction would quietly shape how Jolene McIntyre's story was told, and how much of it was left untold. On screen, Jolene appeared regularly. She was present in scenes, visible in the shop, and occasionally featured in direct moments with Chad or the team. To a casual viewer, she seemed like a supporting presence. A familiar face in the background of someone else's story. But behind the camera, the reality was different. When production crews arrived in Kingsport, the shop did not pause. Builds still had to be completed. Clients still expected their cars. Suppliers still needed to be contacted. Budgets still had to be tracked. The business did not stop because a television show had moved in. Someone had to manage all of that while the cameras were rolling. That someone was Jolene. During active filming seasons, her responsibilities expanded significantly. She coordinated between the production team and the shop's actual workflow, two systems that did not always move at the same speed or toward the same goals. Television production wanted compelling moments. The shop needed completed builds. Bridging that gap required patience, diplomacy, and an ability to hold multiple priorities at once. Jolene held them. She communicated with clients who were now, in some cases, also television participants. She managed their expectations. She reassured them when builds fell behind schedule because a filming day had consumed the afternoon. She kept those relationships intact when they could easily have frayed. She also tracked budgets during a period when spending could spiral quickly. Television builds sometimes required additional materials or modifications that a standard client job would not. Keeping the shop financially stable while accommodating production demands was a balancing act that required constant attention. Few people watching the show at home had any idea this was happening. The editing process of reality television is selective by nature. Hours of footage are compressed into minutes. What ends up on screen reflects the story the production team wants to tell. In the case of Bad Chad Customs, that story was built around Chad's creative vision and the drama of the builds themselves. Jolene's work, organizing, managing, communicating, budgeting, did not make for dramatic television. It made for a functioning business. But those are not the same thing, and television knows which one draws viewers. Over time, a pattern became clear to those paying attention. The more the show grew, the more visible the gap became between what the cameras captured and what Jolene was actually contributing. Her screen time remained relatively limited compared to her actual footprint in the shop's operations. The work that kept the lights on and the builds on schedule was happening just outside the frame. Some fans noticed. Forum threads began appearing that specifically called out Jolene's behind-the-scenes role. Comments on social media acknowledged that the show would look very different without her steady presence managing the parts the audience never saw. It was a quiet acknowledgement from an audience that was more observant than the production may have expected. The emotional weight of this chapter is not one of resentment or grievance. Jolene never publicly complained about her level of recognition. She continued to work, continued to contribute, and continued to be the stabilizing force the shop depended on. That steadiness, in many ways, only made the contrast more striking. A woman was carrying a significant portion of a nationally broadcast television operation, and most people watching it had very little sense of how much. Then came a moment that forced everyone, including the audience, to finally pay attention to exactly how much Jolene was holding together. Every car that rolled out of Bad Chad Customs carried a story. Viewers saw the welding sparks and the finished chrome. They saw Chad standing back to admire the work, and they saw the client's reactions when the reveal happened. Those were the moments television was built for. But before any of those moments existed, a long and unglamorous process had to unfold. And that process ran through Jolene. Custom car builds are not simply acts of mechanical creativity. They are logistical operations. Each project begins with a client conversation, understanding what they want, what they are willing to spend, and what timeline they expect. That conversation requires skill. It requires listening carefully, managing expectations honestly, and making promises that the shop can actually keep. Jolene was often the first point of contact in that process. She helped translate a client's vision into something the shop could realistically execute. She understood the gap between what people imagined and what was financially and mechanically possible. Her role in those early conversations quietly shaped the scope of every build before a single bolt was turned. From there, the sourcing process began. Custom builds require parts that are not always easy to find. Rare components, discontinued hardware, specialty materials. These things do not appear on a shelf at a local auto parts store. They require research, networking, and persistent communication with suppliers and private sellers across the country, and sometimes beyond. According to accounts from fans and observers who followed the show closely, Jolene was deeply involved in this sourcing process. She tracked down leads, made calls, and coordinated deliveries to make sure the right materials arrived at the right time. Without that coordination, builds could stall for weeks waiting on a single component. In television production, a stalled build is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat to the entire filming schedule. Several builds from the series stand out as examples of what this coordination looked like in practice. The shop regularly took on projects that were ambitious beyond what a casual viewer might assume. Some builds involved significant structural modifications, custom fabrication from scratch, or sourcing of parts that had not been manufactured in decades. The degree of planning required to execute those projects was considerable. Jolene kept that planning moving. She tracked budgets across multiple active projects at the same time. She maintained communication with clients throughout the build process, updating them on progress, flagging delays, and ensuring that the relationship stayed intact even when timelines shifted. She worked with Chad to prioritize which jobs needed to move forward and which could wait. That kind of project management is a professional skill. In many industries, it is a full-time job with a formal title and a significant salary. At Bad Chad Customs, it was simply what Jolene did. As the show progressed through its seasons, fan communities began documenting this more systematically. Online discussions emerged that specifically analyzed episodes for evidence of Jolene's involvement. Viewers rewatched scenes and pointed to moments, a phone call in the background, a conversation about costs, a logistics decision made quickly on camera, that revealed a level of operational awareness that went well beyond being a supportive presence. These discussions grew over time. They were not fringe conversations. They appeared across multiple platforms and reflected a genuine reassessment of what the audience had been watching. The show had given viewers a story about one person's creative genius. The audience, looking more carefully, was beginning to see a story about two people's shared labor: creativity and logistics, vision and execution. Chad and Jolene. Neither side of that equation worked without the other. But only one side had been fully visible. The emotional tone of this recognition was not angry or accusatory. It was more like the feeling of finally understanding something you had been looking at for years without quite seeing it. That feeling would deepen considerably in the period that followed. But the build that would define Jolene's legacy most sharply had nothing to do with metal or chrome. It had to do with survival. There are moments in any business when the foundation is truly tested, not by a difficult client or a complicated build. Not by a missed deadline or a budget shortfall, but by something deeper, something personal, something that strips away all the production schedules and camera angles and leaves only the question of what holds when everything else gives way. For Bad Chad Customs, that moment arrived when Chad Hiltz faced serious health challenges. The exact details of Chad's medical situation became known to the public through social media posts and commentary from those close to the shop. Chad was open about the fact that he was dealing with significant health issues, the kind that required real attention and genuine rest. For a man whose identity was built around constant work and creative output, that was not an easy reality to accept. For the shop, it created an immediate and serious problem. Bad Chad Customs was not a large corporation with a management team that could absorb the absence of its central figure. It was a small, personality-driven operation in a small town. Chad's presence was not just important, it was, in many ways, the product itself. The show was built around him. The brand carried his name. The clients came because of his reputation. When that presence was suddenly limited, the question of what would happen next was a real one. The answer came from Jolene. She did not make an announcement. She did not seek attention for what she was doing. She simply stepped into the space that had opened and filled it. Her operational role expanded in ways that went beyond anything that had come before. She became the primary communicator between the shop and the production team during a period when Chad's participation in filming was limited. She managed the client relationships that had been built over years and worked to ensure that people with active builds felt informed and supported. She made decisions. Real decisions, the kind that determined whether the business kept its commitments or failed to meet them. That is a different kind of responsibility than managing a schedule or tracking a budget. It is the responsibility of someone who has fully accepted that the operation depends on her. That if she steps back, things fall apart. Jolene did not step back. According to social media posts and public updates from that period, the shop continued to function. Projects moved forward. Communications were maintained. The external face of Bad Chad Customs remained stable even as the internal reality was deeply uncertain. For anyone who had been watching carefully, this period removed all remaining ambiguity about Jolene's role. She was not a supporting character. She was not a background presence. She was, in the most practical sense of the word, a co-leader of the operation, and during this chapter of the shop's history, she was carrying a weight that most people in her position would have found overwhelming. The emotional reality of that period is difficult to fully capture from the outside. Running a business under public scrutiny is hard. Running it while also supporting a partner through a health crisis is something different entirely. The two demands pull in different directions. The business needs decisions and forward motion. A person in medical difficulty needs patience and presence. Jolene navigated both simultaneously. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not appear in highlight reels or press releases. It shows up in the fact that things are still standing when they easily could have fallen. It shows up in the continuation of work that no one outside the room fully understands. That was the strength Jolene demonstrated during this period. The fans who had already been paying attention responded with recognition. Comments and posts expressing appreciation for Jolene's role multiplied during this time. People who had always sensed that her contribution was larger than the cameras showed now had a clearer picture of just how large it truly was. The shop survived the crisis. Chad recovered. The builds continued. Bad Chad Customs remained on the air and continued to attract viewers. But something had shifted in how at least part of the audience understood the story they had been watching. When the dust settled and the shop was still standing, one question remained. Would the world finally see Jolene McIntyre for what she truly was? Stories about creative people often follow a familiar shape. There is a visionary at the center. There are obstacles. There is a breakthrough. And then there is recognition. The audience cheers for the person they can see most clearly, the one whose name is on the door. But real stories are rarely that simple. Behind most great achievements, there are people whose names are not on the door. People who showed up every day, solved problems that nobody filmed, and kept the machinery running while the spotlight pointed somewhere else. Their absence from the highlight reel does not diminish what they built. It just makes it easier to overlook. Jolene McIntyre's story is, in many ways, the story of one of those people. Over the course of Bad Chad Customs' run on Discovery Channel, audience perception of Jolene changed. In the early seasons, many viewers saw her as Chad's partner, present, supportive, and likable, but secondary. As the show continued, and as more fans began analyzing what they were watching, that perception began to evolve. Forum discussions, YouTube commentary, and social media threads gradually built a more complete picture of her contributions. By the time the show had run several seasons, a significant portion of the fan base understood something that the production had never explicitly stated. Jolene McIntyre was a co-architect of everything Bad Chad Customs had become. That recognition, while not universal, represented something meaningful. It meant that the story had not been entirely lost, just temporarily obscured. The cameras had captured more than they intended to, and an observant audience had pieced together what the editing had left out. Jolene's story also connects to something larger than one shop in one small town. Women have always worked in the automotive and trades industries. They have managed businesses, handled finances, organized logistics, and supported the operational side of creative and mechanical work. But they have not always received credit proportional to their contribution. The pattern is familiar across many industries. The person with the most visible, dramatic role attracts the recognition, while the person managing the systems that make that role possible works in relative obscurity. Bad Chad Customs is an unusually well-documented example of this pattern, precisely because the cameras were present. Every episode contained fragments of evidence. Jolene on the phone. Jolene reviewing paperwork. Jolene in conversation about costs or timing or client expectations. The documentation existed. It just required an audience willing to look at it differently. That shift in perspective from background to essential is what makes her story worth telling in full. The show's legacy is complex, as most reality television legacies are. It gave viewers something genuine, a real shop, real builds, real personalities. It brought attention to the custom car world in a way that celebrated craft and creativity. And it introduced millions of viewers to a community in Nova Scotia that most of them would never have encountered otherwise. But it also told an incomplete story, not through malice, but through the natural selective pressure of television production. The most visually compelling elements rose to the surface. The essential but unglamorous work stayed underneath. Jolene's ongoing role at Bad Chad Customs, based on available public information, has continued to reflect the same steady commitment that defined her involvement from the beginning. She has remained part of the operation, not as a celebrity, not as a television personality seeking her own spotlight, but as someone who genuinely cares about the work and the people doing it. That consistency is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Fame did not change her approach. Recognition, when it came from fans and online communities, did not alter how she showed up to work. The cameras and the viewers and the television contracts were always secondary to the actual job. There is something worth sitting with in that. In an era when visibility often seems to be the point, when the platform is the goal and the work is just content, Jolene McIntyre's story offers a different example. The work was always the point. The visibility was incidental. Great businesses, like great stories, are rarely built by one person. They are built by the person in front of the camera and the person off to the side, making sure the camera has something worth filming. At Bad Chad Customs, the person off to the side had a name. And now you know it. Some stories are told through the loudest voice in the room. But the most important ones, the ones that hold everything together, are almost always told in silence. Jolene McIntyre never asked for this recognition. She did not write a book about her contributions. She did not give interviews demanding credit. She showed up, did the work, and let the results speak quietly over time. But the results did speak. And for those who listened carefully, who watched the show not just for the builds, but for the full picture behind them, her story became impossible to ignore. Bad Chad Customs was built on talent, passion, and an extraordinary ability to turn scrap into something beautiful. That is Chad Hiltz's gift, and it is a real one. But the shop that housed that gift, the operation that sustained it, the business that carried it to a national audience, that was built by two people. One of them had his name on the sign. The other one made sure the lights stayed on. If this story made you think differently about the people working behind the scenes of something great, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told.